Switch 2 has been out for a while now, but we at Digital Foundry really haven't been looking at many Unreal Engine games on it. There are a good couple, but Unreal Engine 5 in general on the system has been quite rare. And as of now, though, there are a good couple titles out there that we finally want to talk about. And to talk about them today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague here, Oliver Mackenzie. How you doing there, Oliver?
Yes, Alex, we're here to talk about Unreal Engine 5 today. We've got a few titles to talk about. I did actually do a video on Hogwarts Legacy a couple months ago, but that's Unreal Engine 4, not UE5, does not have any of the really exciting elements that define UE5 in our eyes at Digital Foundry. So we're here to talk about some of those more kind of interesting titles today, those UE5 titles.
Indeed, indeed. And one of them is actually quite recently released and a bit under the radar, but I really liked what I saw on PC, at least from a gameplay perspective, and that is Cronos, The New Dawn. And yeah, Oliver, you, though, very specifically looked at this title.
Yeah, I was very curious about this game because this is a brand new UE5 title. We know from your coverage, it's using Lumen, it's using Nanite, it's using VSM on PC. It's a pretty advanced looking UE5 title. It's even got hardware Lumen on PC, which is something we don't often see with UE5 titles that are cross-platform these days. So I wanted to approach it on Switch 2 and just see like, hey, what's going on here? You know, are we getting kind of the full buffet, the full suite of features here, or are we getting something a little bit less than that? So when I approached Cronos on Switch 2, it's kind of a weird game. It's very dark, small areas. You know, it's kind of doing maybe some different things with its lighting for gameplay purposes, perhaps. Like it's got that bright flashlight. It's a very dark game, not much ambient light there. So it's actually not too trivial to work out what this game is doing in terms of headline UE5 features, because it's very unlike the other games that I've tested on UE5, which are often very easy to see at a glance what they're doing, what they're using. It's often very easy to tell. So I went over to the PC for comparisons. And I compared the game between the very low preset, the low preset, and Switch 2. So on very low, the game looks a lot like Switch 2. Like Shadows from the Sun, for instance, are pretty clearly cascaded shadow maps. They behave like CSM. They look like CSM. The flashlight shadows look very high resolution in that very low mode, but they appear to just be like a high resolution shadow map. Because if we force VSM off using the console with Unreal Engine Unlocker, with the low settings enabled, the game looks exactly the same between that and Switch 2 with VSM disabled there. Right. So for Nanite, you should be able to see in these shots that the Switch version is using lower detail models relative to the PC with low settings. More like the PC on very low settings. But yeah, the PC low setting gets those higher detail models, which are sometimes very high quality assets, quite nice looking assets there. And then when we're walking through this section, notice how Switch 2 is using less detailed models, which are popping in. That's for like the branches and the rocky outcroppings in front of the player here. Whereas on low, the detail looks much higher quality and it's not popping in. It's consistent from all distances, which is kind of what we would expect to see from Nanite geometry. So I think there's probably a very good case to say these are probably Nanite meshes on PC low, very likely Nanite meshes on PC low, but on very low and Switch 2, not Nanite. So lastly, for Lumen, you'll notice in these shots, Switch 2 again lines up very nicely with very low and not low. We don't get the flashlight bounce in this shot. The light from outside doesn't spill in nicely in this shot. And then we get some light leak in this shot with the reddish artificial light. All that matches PC on very low. And finally, kind of as a coup de grace here, if we try to turn on any Lumen visualizations on very low, nothing shows up. But if we do the same on low, like the Lumen card visualization here, we get all kinds of Lumen visualizations. We can turn on all of them. We can go through the game and view its Lumen representation of the scene in any number of different views, which I'm showing on screen here. So that's quite satisfying and interesting, but it's not something we can see on very low. So it's very unlikely they're using those techniques on very low there rather. And the GI that is present has like a limited range, so you can see some leak from like the sky in this interior scene, again matching PC on very low, like that kind of neon kind of blue color out in the distance there, quite distracting. So all this suggests that Switch 2 is running without Lumen, Nanite, and VSM. I also performed some other tests here with the console and whatnot that seem to indicate that, yeah, Lumen, Nanite, VSM probably not in play here. And it also says to me that very low is very close to Switch 2. And I kind of suggest that maybe very low is actually derived from the work that was necessary, presumably, to get the game working on Switch 2. Especially because very low is only available as like a global preset option. It's not available in the custom settings for the game. The custom settings for the game only have low, medium, or rather low, high, and epic options, not that very low preset, which kind of makes sense because you wouldn't want to give users options where they could like combine, nanite with CSMs or do different things like this that are like not supported or not standard or would produce a awkward visual result, right? So in this case, they seem to basically say, here's our preset for the lowest of the low PCs, for the handhelds, for the Switch 2. And then if you want those higher features, you got to go up a step. Even to the low settings, you get everything. Very low, you get nothing. So it's kind of the situation on Switch 2. I think we've kind of established probably not using those techniques, which is kind of interesting. It says its own volumes potentially about the Switch 2 here. But what's your kind of reaction to that, Alex?
This game does base a lot of its visual quality at times around the usage of those techniques, I would say, specifically Lumen and Nanite, less so VSMs in this title. There's a lot of areas where a lot of the moody lighting and the consistency of the lighting comes from it. But looking at the side-by-sides, given the fact that it is such a dark game, and it is kind of old school in design and how claustrophobic it is, it does get away actually with turning off something like Lumen much more than I thought it arguably could have when I was just looking at the PC code where you couldn't turn it off. At least I didn't see the very low setting when I was playing it. So that's kind of funny that I like how you discovered it after the fact, after my video even came out. And yeah, that surprised me for one. That's kind of like, it actually works relatively well. But it's also kind of a shame to not see it in this title, because given the performance that you're going to be talking about in a minute, I almost feel like it would have been interesting to have seen what that would have looked like if they offered it as a mode. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do definitely. I'm definitely curious to see what it would look like if they'd offered it as a mode. And in particular, I'm kind of interested in that question because, when we looked at a title like Star Wars Outlaws, right? We saw a lot of commonality there between the Switch 2 version and the Series S version. It seemed like they managed to translate the essential elements. I'm not saying everything. Obviously, the Series S version still looks better. Don't get me wrong. But they seem to translate the things that make that title the way it is on consoles to Switch 2 in a very kind of compelling, interesting, satisfying way. But here, if you go over to Series S and you test out that version, which should be the closest, it's very different looking. So if you look at this shot, for instance, which we talked about earlier, you see that light leak is not occurring on Series S. It is occurring on Switch 2. If you look at this shot, you see that kind of spill from the outdoors coming in here. Again, this is the same stuff that we saw on PC. We are not seeing it on Switch 2. We're not seeing that increased lighting detail. We are seeing it on Series S. Again, look at this shot. We're seeing that VSM-like shadow with its nice fall off of the player character on Series S. On Switch 2, not nearly as much. Again, with the flashlight shadow here, we're seeing that kind of progression there. And of course, with that nanite presentation as well, we are seeing that consistency at basically all levels away from the objects there. Looks quite good. So overall, the game also just looks a lot better. There are a lot of things that aren't related to Lumen, Nanite, and VSM here, like there's high resolution volumetric lighting. Also, just the GI presentation on Switch 2 looks kind of bizarre. Like you get that neon blue tone, maybe like 8 or 9 meters ahead of the player in interior areas. Looks very bizarre, like you can see in this kind of interior space here, popping in a very strange manner. So my overall impression is that Series S basically looks like a fully featured take on Cronos, whereas Switch 2 is definitely not that. In terms of image quality, you do see some advantages perhaps of that Switch 2 approach, where overall the two images don't look that different. But, Series S, it's a little bit less aliased, doesn't have as much breakup. I think with Series S here, we're looking at a TSR variant, whereas with the Switch 2, we're probably looking at a DLSS variant, although I would imagine it would be one of the cheaper ones based on how it's behaving. It is not showing us those kind of curved traditional DLSS edges. It is not dealing with like disocclusions. It's not dealing with movements so elegantly as DLSS often does. It's looking more like what we might have seen out of a title like Fast Fusion or Hogwarts Legacy, where it's breaking up a little bit more, but it's clearly not exhibiting some of the same kind of issues as TSR. It's a little bit worse in some respects in motion. In static shots, it actually looks pretty good there. Series S is 720p internally. Switch 2 is about 540p. But then there's some interesting notes here on performance, where performance is quite good on Switch 2. It's almost a lock 30 FPS. There's like one little stutter that I saw in my time playing, but nothing too bad here. On Series S, it's also mostly a lock 30 FPS, but it has those kind of repeatable perturbations that we see when we're moving around, which I think you also saw on PC there, Alex. Didn't you find that on PC as well?
Oh yeah, it's basically, well, it depends on which area you're in, but especially when you go outside to the outside areas, like where you can see a lot of the sky, those are areas between larger gameplay zones, and I'm at least talking about the intro of the game here, and there's on something like a Ryzen 5 3600, there's easily, with the software Luminon, you'll see like 50 milliseconds, sometimes 66 millisecond frame time spikes, using those high settings, at least roughly. So it doesn't surprise me too much because obviously on console you're not going to be getting things like shader compilation stutter. It's just not a thing there. But things like traversal stutter is something we've seen across the generations that still somehow manages to infect those console versions of Unreal Engine games.
Yeah. I also very briefly looked at the game in portable mode, and there it actually looks pretty sharp, pretty decent, very 1080p-like. Again, in common with the docked mode, it actually looks pretty good on the portable screen there. But weirdly, when I tested it, it also ran at 540p internally, so I'm wondering, it might actually just be the same configuration, so I don't know what to make of that exactly. It certainly seems very odd. Maybe that's not intended, who knows, but that is a very odd development here. So I think, maybe they can do something with that. But ultimately, maybe this is a bit of a useful counterpoint to what we see with Star Wars Outlaws, because this is like UE5. It's very demanding. Maybe Bloober team did not have like a year to work on a port or something here. They had a limited amount of time. They're working with a commodity engine that they might not have so much control over input into. And UE5 tends to be quite heavy. And actually, when we look at the game on Steam Deck, we can kind of see that maybe this title, like a lot of other UE5 titles, does not fare so well in the handhelds when you do pile in all these settings, right? So if I look at the game on Steam Deck and I compare performance in very low versus low, we see roughly a 50% FPS gain going from low to very low. At the low preset with FSR3 in performance mode at 720p output, so that's like 360p internally. I really don't think it's too limited by pixel count there. And in some sections, the performance collapses where I think maybe we're running out of available RAM or something like that. It's not running too well there in those sections, although I don't think that would apply to Switch 2 as much necessarily. So I do think that maintaining full feature parity is going to be a little bit challenging for a lot of UE5 titles. I think we see that with our next title. But yeah, Cronos, interesting data point. One of the more intense UE5 titles we've seen, I think, in recent times. It's certainly a very good-looking UE5 title. Also a UE5 title that notably does not make use of those headline features on Switch 2. Does make use of those features on Series S, so perhaps that's not quite a very well-supported mode of operation at the moment.
I mean, I do wonder at this moment in time exactly where Switch 2 sits in the Unreal Engine 5 development environment. For example, over time, we saw, right as Unreal Engine 5 came out, the initial, these were kind of pie in the sky things. They didn't actually bear out in the games. But we saw like the initial appreciation and kind of settings that Epic set up in the background for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, where they said like 1080p internal resolution, epic settings is 30 FPS with software Lumen. And they said the high settings would be 1080p 60. And the games were obviously different than what those said, but they actually came up with profiles. And they adjusted these over time and they changed them. But here, I'm wondering, given the fact that they almost didn't even attempt to use any of the headline Unreal Engine 5 features, makes me wonder where it is actually right now on the Unreal Engine 5 side, if there are settings presets that use the headlining features of Unreal Engine 5 for Switch 2, or maybe they don't actually exist in a concrete form yet, so it's kind of a wild west. You would have to set them up yourselves, and developers are just kind of afraid to do it. Because at the moment, the fallbacks that do exist, if you don't want to use Lumen, Nanite, or VSM in a title that was designed around them, they can look a little awkward. I just go back to when you looked at the Talos principle there,
yes.
Running on Series S, where like if you just like run the Series S version of that game, it barely looks like the other versions, right? It's missing all the stuff that makes the game look like it does, and arguably makes it look worse than like previous generation titles. So I do actually wonder where that is, and maybe the next title is a hint for us as to what's going on with Unreal Engine 5.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your reaction about this next title in particular because, so for Cronos, it was mainly me playing and showing you some footage. But for this next title and the title following it, these are actually multiplayer titles for which Alex and I had to engage in a couple hours of cooperative gameplay, of some multiplayer gameplay to actually get our comparisons here and to take a look at these titles. So the first game we're going to talk about here in this multiplayer section is Fortnite, Epic's kind of Unreal Engine showcase. This game obviously got a big enhancement to Unreal Engine 5 back, I think, in 2022 on current generation consoles and PC. Looks very, very handsome. That mode has gotten some development since, with the introduction, I believe, of hardware lumen support across the consoles. Gotten some various upgrades, various enhancements since that point. But it's a very, very handsome and generally very performant Unreal Engine 5 game. So what can you report on from our experience playing Fortnite on the Switch 2, Alex?
Well, it was immediately obvious, I would say, that I was on the Switch here and Oliver was on the Series S, so that is Switch 2, sorry. And just from having played the game so much for coverage on PC and on the consoles, loading it up in the 60 FPS mode that it has on offer there, it's kind of default. It was obvious to see that this was not the version of Fortnite that had the Unreal Engine 5 features inside of it from a visual perspective. Obviously, performance, that it's going to be using a similar engine version as to the latest. It's interfacing in a cross-platform way. But when you just look at them side by side with the Series S, we'll talk about resolution in a second here, but there are so many scenes, like if you just look inside any sort of doorway opening, you'll see that there is no lumen there at all on the Switch 2 version. If you're like inside of a house, you'll see that there's no lumen at all there. Everything kind of goes back to that glowy, grayish blue color that you see in a lot of games that don't use ray tracing. It's just the sky color leaking inside the building. Almost anywhere you look, the lighting looks completely different. Not only that, you look at any of the models, there's this docking moorings, I think, on a dock. They're completely rounded off in the Series S version. On the Switch 2 version, very blocky and angular, almost comedically so. You look at the shadows, for example, they all there are using standard shadow maps, cascaded shadow maps on the Switch 2 versus a degraded version of VSM, but still nonetheless VSM there on Series S. You look at another thing that they added in one of the updates to Fortnite when they brought out 5.4, the vegetation. They updated all the vegetation models in the game to use versions of nanite vegetation that have really a lot of intricate detail in them, like individual leaves and whatnot being modeled out. But on the the Switch 2 version, they're just kind of like rounded, transparency cards at best. And they look quite a bit different and honestly worse. Things like just walking into the distance, you'll see very generically like just stuff popping in quite close to the camera that doesn't happen to the same degree at all on Series S, even though Series S still actually has technically pop-in at a distance due to HLOD behavior within Unreal Engine 5. But it's basically the last gen version here when you look at it from a visual perspective. And that is quite telling, I almost feel. I don't know how you feel about it, but of all the people and groups that I would have thought would have shown off Unreal Engine 5 features working on Switch 2, I thought it would have been Epic because they kind of want to show the game off at its best, but they didn't appear to do that. And Oliver, you can talk a bit about resolution maybe, but I don't know. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it's certainly very curious because you would expect, I think Epic has this very strong incentive to show, especially show their partners, show their clients, we can get Unreal Engine 5 running on Switch 2 and we can deliver all these features. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Of course, that would be great if it could be done. But I think here they're also up against different kinds of constraints, different kinds of pressures, where this is a 60 FPS title, I think, predominantly. This is a game that people are looking for those higher refreshes on. They are looking for that for competitive play. And I suspect if you were to deliver those features on Switch 2, perhaps you might be looking at a 30 FPS title. Like Rich tested The T239 chip emulated kind of the T239 chip in a sense with his RTX 2050 mobile GPU a couple of years ago, doing some testing well prior to the announcement of the Switch 2, obviously very prior to the release of the Switch 2 as well. And he found that you could kind of technically squeeze 30 FPS out of Fortnite with some dips using the various Unreal Engine 5 features, having them all enabled, having Lumen, having VSM, having Nanite enabled on the PC version with hardware Lumen or software Lumen. By the way, he did not find a dramatic difference in performance between those two options on that Ampere-based chip. But would that be sufficient for Switch 2 users who are already coming from Fortnite and Switch 1, which is a 30 FPS title? I think they're probably looking for that enhancement to performance more than anything else. But yeah, overall, I think with Fortnite and Switch 2, all of Alex's comments really ring true. It just looks like a totally massively different game. Just looks much, much better on Series S. It's just a categorical difference in lighting quality and model quality and even in shadowing quality in many instances. It's just a really dramatic difference. And I think you do notice, especially in interiors, that kind of leaky blue tinted look that we're so used to seeing from Fortnite across many different platforms, used to seeing in general from open world type games that are using engines like Unreal 4 that can't really deliver a really granular, really good GI solution for their worlds. But on Series S, you are getting that really nice indirect lighting detail. You are getting that really nice lumen detail. You aren't getting that on Switch at all. So yeah, just a huge difference there. But one area where, interestingly, the Switch 2 version does have some advantages over Series S lies in resolution and image quality, because Series S is rendering at about 720p-ish in a lot of the shots I looked at. In the same shots, Switch 2 is rendering a little bit higher than 1080p. I believe the game is using TSR on both platforms. Based on the artifact patterns on Switch, they look very similar to Series S, which we know is a TSR title. Definitely. Obviously, Epic would use TSR. I think they probably have some incentive even to use it on Switch because they want to show that their own proprietary technology is perhaps better or at least appropriate for use on Switch 2 as an alternative to DLSS perhaps. But I would say here that both machines produce a fairly similar looking final image. It's just that Switch 2 has a little bit less artifacting in motion. Looks a little bit cleaner there. Mm-hmm. Epic is quoting 1224p in docked play, which I think might be the reconstruction target for Switch 2. But performance is quite good as well. There's some minor frame rate drops on like sector transitions, loads, whatever, perhaps. But it's not a bad performer overall. It's generally 60 FPS on Switch 2, which is quite nice. Mm-hmm. In portable mode, it's rendering at 900p according to Epic, and internal pixel counts coming close to 900p. Again, 900p might be that kind of output target for the TSR. And it's rendering at, in my tests, at least 60 FPS-ish, although, with VRR in the mix, it could be somewhat more variable than that, but it certainly seems to be that way. On Switch 2, so yeah, I would definitely concur with you there that it's a little bit unusual. It's a little bit notable, I think, that Epic is choosing to forego those features on Switch 2. But there's one last title that we have to talk about today, which is a title that is a UE5 title. It's a good-looking UE5 title as well, but critically, it's not using some of these headlining UE5 features on any platform. It's kind of using more of a feature set akin with a lot of UE4 titles, I would say. And that game is Split Fiction. But Split Fiction is notable in some respects in the kinds of concessions that it's still making on Switch 2, despite notionally having a feature set that should be pretty well suited to the hardware. It's actually not running necessarily as well as we might expect or want out of the Switch 2 hardware. Isn't that true, Alex?
Yeah, basically, well, the first thing when you put these two side to side, Series S versus the Switch 2 here, I actually think they're visually quite similar to one another in many ways. Less large differences or smaller differences than we had seen with the previous two titles we talked about, at least from a visual perspective. But the most thing you notice right away is just the refresh rate and frame rate. It's 30 FPS. Like it was immediately apparent to me, oh, this is a 30 FPS game. And that definitely has some knock-on effects that I think we'll have to talk about. But in general, a lot of the rest of the presentation was quite similar, even in terms of resolutions here. I believe they're both targeting, I don't think it's TSR, but a TAAU presentation maxing out at 1080p.
Yep.
And there are some differences, though, there in terms of image quality that do show up. For example, hair in cutscenes is noticeably more aliased than it is on Series S. on the Switch 2 version, and it's hard to actually chalk that up to something without further investigation, but that is just immediately a visual difference. Another thing you'll see in cutscenes is also things like depth of field have been stripped out of the Switch 2 version, and that does give the game at times I would say, crisper resolve when you're in cutscenes. Like if you were just not paying attention, you'd be like, oh, this is higher res on Switch 2. It isn't, of course. It's just there's no depth of field at all being applied to the image. Other things, when you look at them, like you're still getting SSR, screen space reflections there on the Switch 2 version. They are sometimes a bit laggy and ghosty, but they're there. Just as much as they are actually on the Series S. You still get some occasional ambient occlusion. Shadow maps, though, appear to be lower res than we see in the Series S version. In the few areas that do use real-time cascaded shadow maps, it's actually not across the entire game. They kind of mix techniques here. Some static versions of the shadows are in the game, too. And in general, though, if you ignore the frame rate and ignore those other nips and tucks I just talked about, it actually compares pretty well to the Series S version. I was a little bit surprised, regardless of everything, that even for what is ostensibly of an Unreal Engine 4 title from a visual perspective, and it's already using things to improve performance a lot, but like baked lighting and baked shadows, I was still surprised to see that they had to turn down things like shadow map resolution, where usually shadow map resolution after a certain point is not a function of how much compute you have available, but it's somewhat a function of how much memory you have available. And we know actually that Switch 2 has more memory available to games, I think, than we have on Series S. So I was surprised to see that cut back in there, and I wonder actually how completely necessary it is. But at least at the 30 FPS that was there, it was pretty consistent. There were a handful of drops occasionally, but yeah, a fine title overall on Switch 2, but it was just strange to see that it had any sort of reductions against that Series S version.
Yeah, to me, the disappointment here really comes from the fact that, we know Switch 2 has DLSS, right? And we know from prior games being ported to Switch 2 that oftentimes, developers who are looking over their work with maybe a fresh set of eyes, have some new tools available to them. Hopefully, they can kind of leverage some of these efficiencies in Switch 2 to deliver a more comparable version of their game than you would expect based on the specs. But here it's kind of just scaling in that kind of more linear way, where Switch 2 in docked mode is maybe half a Series S, give or take. And so Switch 2 in docked mode is half a Series S, give or take. They're still using the same TAA. They're not using some of those more exotic features on Switch 2 to deliver a faster refresh, to deliver a more satisfying gameplay experience, which is kind of a shame because we do see that from other developers. Obviously, Star Wars Outlaws would be the number one example here. I think on Switch 2, our kind of number one port, the best port that we've seen on Switch 2 so far. Most impressive, aligns closely with the Series S version in a lot of respects that are very highly impressive. We're not seeing that here, and I think it's kind of interesting because in handheld mode, you said docked mode, 1080p 30, right? That's the performance profile there. In handheld mode, it's not 30 FPS. It's actually closer to 40 FPS. It's hard to count exactly here, but it's in that kind of vicinity, I would think, of 40 FPS. And it's doing so at a resolution internally of about 720p in the shots I tested. So we know presumably they have the CPU overhead to pull off a 40 FPS gameplay experience. That would have been nice to see on Switch 2. Maybe in 120 hertz output. We are not seeing that here. So yeah, I think that's kind of an unfortunate state of affairs, and it really kind of shows like, hey, the Switch 2, it's powerful hardware, it can punch above its weight, seeing impressive things out of it all across the board. But if you do not leverage its unique features, you will not get a uniquely good experience. You're going to get something that scales in a way that's not too satisfactory necessarily on the Switch 2 hardware. So as kind of a final note here, I kind of wanted to close out if you had any kind of final thoughts on UE5 Switch 2 performance. Obviously, Alex is very intimately familiar with Unreal Engine 5, how it works. He spent a lot of time looking at Unreal Engine 5 titles. And in particular, in light of a certain title coming out, I believe, on October 3rd, which is Borderlands 4. It's a title that we know is using Lumen, Nanite, and VSM from its various showings on PC, other console platforms. It's obviously out. I think tomorrow as we record this, it could be out today as this video is being released. People are probably enjoying that game already on the consoles and the PC platform. But from early showings on Switch 2, not looking as nice, coming in at 30 FPS, not necessarily showing off obvious evidence of those visual features of Lumen, Nanite, VSM.
Right.
Not showing that kind of visual sophistication we're used to seeing from other platforms. Might be another example, like Cronos, like Fortnite, of a game coming in on Switch 2, coming in with a visual feature set that's clearly well below the other kind of extant console and PC versions of a high-profile kind of game here.
Yeah, so coming to that first point, I mean, and it does tie into the Borderlands discussion, based upon what we've seen here and the fact that even Epic in their own game, which has been updated to support Switch 2 natively, don't use any of the headline Unreal Engine 5 features. I would say they're, at least in their current form, there's probably no good preset made for them to function well within the constraints of games that have already been made. And a lot of these games have been made within the constraints of targeting very fast CPUs in relative to the Switch 2s. You look at Cronos, you look at Borderlands, especially in light of some comments from the developers there, that they do actually have a pretty high lower level barrier to running those high level features like Lumen, Nanite, and VSM at the same time. And I think that shows quite well when I look at these games running on PC. As soon as I run them on the Ryzen 5 3600, either I come into issues with traversal stutter in some games, or games just being CPU limited below 60 FPS quite often on the Ryzen 5 3600 when things are pumped up there in Unreal Engine 5 titles. I recently saw that with Metal Gear Solid Delta on PC, which was actually somewhat surprising. And that is actually one of the areas that on the Switch 2 that doesn't favor, in spite of its great feature set, doesn't have a very fast CPU. Right. I think in Fortnite, when we look at that specifically, the fact that we are seeing some transition zone frame time issues when I was playing the game, I think if you were to turn on things like, regardless of how they work on the GPU, if you were to turn on things like Nanite, Lumen, or VSM, as soon as those, you'd hit those loading barriers in the game, I think you'd see much larger frame time issues on something like Switch 2, given all the extra things it's now having to process. And I think that maybe would be getting in the way of playability, beyond the fact that maybe it would have to target 30 FPS if it did turn on some of those features. So I think at least right now, as the engine sits and the games that are being developed for it, primarily for this current generation of consoles, and how it was designed around, all those features were designed around at least a certain base level of CPU power and GPU compute, I think it's actually probably pretty hard to get scalability down to the Switch 2 with those features on at the moment, and would probably need more dedicated development to make it possible in the first place at a good frame rate. But also from the developer side, I think something like Cronos was probably based upon the fact that they even have a very low setting, was like, oh, they designed the game around a certain base level here, and they did as much as they could, cutting off all the features to get it to run on Switch 2. That's not actually like how they want the game to look, right? So I feel like that is kind of how it stands based upon what we've seen so far, or at least what I would assume is occurring. It would be cool to see these features coming out on Switch 2, but maybe it's not realistic at this point in time, and we're going to have to wait, like we did kind of with the Series S, Series X, and PlayStation 5 for Epic to update the engine multiple times and actually create good profiles that they can then allow developers to use in a good way. For Borderlands, though, I think that's just going to be another showing of what we've already seen so far. And it's going to look quite a bit different than I imagine in most areas of the game, especially in the open world sections where there's going to be a moving time of day. And that's really where features like VSM and Lumen come to bear. And not having them will lead to a very different looking experience.
Yeah, I think we do know that Epic is probably working pretty hard on Switch 2. Obviously, We know that The Matrix Awakens was shown off on Switch 2 some years ago, right? I think in 2023, shown off to developers behind closed doors at Gamescom, I believe. And we also know that Epic is working on a ton of optimizations, including a much enhanced version of Hardware Lumen that can run at 60 FPS in the consoles, that can run at 60 FPS on something like a PlayStation 5. We're seeing that in The Witcher 4. We're seeing all kinds of engine enhancements. Arguably, Unreal Engine 5 is like the engine of this generation, but it's really the engine of the end of this generation, because the kind of key, really exciting Unreal Engine 5 titles are only really coming online now. I think with titles like Hellblade, obviously that came out about a year ago. Mafia: The Old Country, a recent kind of smaller scale, but still open world UE5 title, very impressive looking. That came out recently. That would not have been possible prior to more recent Unreal Engine versions that supported nanite for foliage and things like this. So I hope that Epic is working very hard on some presets, like you mentioned, that will work well on Switch 2 and could enable developers to bring over their titles to Switch 2 in a more kind of visually cromulent fashion, a more feature-complete fashion, where they are showing off some of those visual features on Switch 2. And the games fundamentally, hopefully, will look similar between Switch 2, Series S, PS5, Series X, PS5 Pro, PC. I want to see that kind of commonality in feature set such that you're getting enough on Switch 2 that even, you compare it to high-end PC and it's more of an increase in fidelity than a kind of categorical increase or a kind of qualitative increase where it just looks totally different. That's not really what I want to see, right? And so hopefully we'll see some developments in that front, and we'll see a homogenization of the way those games look, perhaps to some significant degree. Obviously there will be differences, but I hope we will see that in time on Switch 2. So yeah, I think that's probably going to do it for us today, Alex. Thank you very much for joining me on this adventure, this spelunking down the rabbit hole of Unreal Engine 5 on Switch 2. Really appreciate it.
Anytime. I mean, this was my first Switch 2 video, but there should hopefully be one in the near future.
Yes, Alex has lost his Switch 2 virginity with our gameplay session, and he's looking forward to covering Switch 2 in exacting detail in the future, covering some very technical topics, looking at Switch 2 under the microscope in different kinds of ways, which we're very excited to see the fruits of those efforts. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. And signing off, Alex.
Auf Wiedersehen.